You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I'm Sherry Lipp, the marketing manager at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with Stimulus Technologies CEO Nathan Whittacre. And today we are going to be talking about wearables, and that is beyond your smartwatch and beyond your Fitbit. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry. This will be hopefully an interesting topic, and there's been some interesting trends over the last year about wearables. So maybe we can enlighten some people and see what's going on out there with wearables, and of course AI associated with wearables. An interesting topic to update on.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, most of us are familiar with smartwatches. They've been around for a while and Fitbits, but now they've expanded, and Nathan has his. Now they've expanded to a lot of things. Some of them work usage and some of them personal usage. Probably expanded our thoughts on security with these.
I mean, wearables obviously for personal use have been around for a long time. Apple Watch came a few years ago out with the storm. Obviously, there's others that have been around for a while. Initially, a lot of wearables connected via Bluetooth to, some type of device, whether it was your phone or tablet. But now, a lot of the wearables want, connecting directly to the Wi-Fi networks. And so one thing, maybe a caveat that we need to talk about, we've had some podcasts and talked about Internet of Things devices, IoT devices. There's a bit of security that we have to think about with any type of IoT device, and that could be wearables too. There's some security concerns, and you don't necessarily want all these devices, especially personal devices, connecting to your company's network and primary Wi-Fi. So most, my recommendation, and we won't, spend a lot of time on this, but my recommendation is you have some type of IoT Wi-Fi network that's segregated off that these type of devices connect to, so that you can keep security between these IoT devices, which are hackable, potentially, and do require updates. And you may not, want to 100% trust these devices because, especially the employees' devices, because they can, be a security risk for your environment if you have them on your general public network. So that'll be the end of that. But you just have to, just concerned about security. But certainly we've seen a proliferation of wearables over the last few years, far beyond smartwatches, and they're going into, more business centric uses, which are kind of interesting. So be fun to talk about it.
So I hadn't really thought about it beyond personal use, but now I've been reading that there are everything becomes smart. So there's smart badges, smart things that will get you into the building. So I imagine that's like a greater risk.
As more and more things, get on the network, or, have more intelligence, there are more points of failure potentially. Even like you look at like hotels, for example, now with your cell phone, you can, get into your room, and, there's more as the network expands and there's more entry points into the network, there's more risks for security. And as we try to make things easier on team members, again, it opens up more risks for security. So there's just always a balance between what we want to do with technology and making sure that we properly secure that technology.
And is it an expansion of like safeguards we already put into place when we're incorporating these, or do we have to come up with new ways to protect against threats?
Well, I think it's the same stuff that we've always been doing. You think about the secure Wi-Fi that I just mentioned. We've been talking about that for a very long time. I think knowing where these devices come from is really important. There has been history of, bad firmware or, bugs inside some of these systems. So, the FCC and other organizations have blocked certain manufacturers from China, for example, that we cannot buy them in the United States. There's a drone maker that's been banned, the world's largest, from selling products in the US or certain of their products. So, there's certainly a concern about embedded security. So, there was a case not too many years ago that, and this isn't necessarily wearables, but switches and routers made by a company called Huawei, which is again a Chinese brand. They were monitoring the traffic that was going on corporate networks and through all these internet routers and sending it back to China, and it was embedded in the chips. And so nobody, it took a long time to detect what was happening because it wasn't a software issue, it wasn't a firmware issue, it was actually built into the chips of the device. So we do, there is a concern about where these devices come from, making sure that we're, using approved devices. Just because you can buy it off of Amazon doesn't mean that you should. And especially from a business standpoint, if you're dealing with any confidential information or, things that you want to make sure are secured, that you are using devices from reputable manufacturers that are purchased in the United States.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, there's devices now. There's the glasses that will record, and then there's like AI note takers and stuff like that. Is there ways businesses can protect themselves against work information being stored on these kind of devices?
Well, I think that's a really good point. So I was in a meeting last week. One of the people in the meeting wore his note taker the whole time. He let everybody know that he was wearing it. That is an interesting question is, these note takers are now wearable devices, whether it's glasses or his was particularly just a little clip-on badge on his shirt, on his lapel, but it was recording the entire conversation and then summarizing it and then putting, the notes and, really amazing tool, obviously, to be able to take notes of all conversations. But it is, a scary thing to know that you're not just being recorded, but immediately transcribed and listened to by AI, and all that information is stored somewhere in the cloud. You do want to make sure from a business standpoint, the devices that are being used in the workplace have good confidential protections of the data, and you need to part of your AI plan or your employee use acceptable use policies need to define when and where those type of recording devices can be used. Things like those glasses, wearables for AI recording, and these devices are really small. I mean, the glasses are would just look like these glasses here, maybe a little bit a little bit larger bridge. They're not like the VR display that take up your entire face. These are very small devices. The recording device that I just talked to, it was a maybe about an inch round, and you maybe not even notice it on somebody if they're wearing it. So definitely a concern inside environments. Here in Nevada, there was just a case recently that a politician was censured because recording conversations that were supposedly confidential. And I think this is going to proliferate even more as these wearables become more common. So just something to be on the lookout and maybe define inside your organization your policy around these.
Yeah, I was going to ask if the laws have caught up because we know there are laws about recording phone conversations and different states have different rules on that. So are there laws that cover just recording conversations?
It is the same law. So it's, like Nevada, for example, is a two-party state. So both parties have to agree. Some states are a single-party state. So that means that one party of the conversation is all that needs to authorize it. So in that type of scenario, somebody could bring a recording device into any conversation and record as long as they're aware that it's being recorded. The other parties don't have to be aware. So it would be good to know what the laws are in your state. More importantly, though, I think inside our businesses, we need to find what our regulations are, of what conversations can or cannot be recorded and transcribed. A lot of times, and this isn't exactly wearables, but you jump into a team meeting now and all the note takers are there before the people show up. You just have to define which meetings are allowed for note takers and which are not. When is it confidential? A lot of times in the meetings that I'm in, I'll use a note taker if I want to, and then shut it off if it's going to be a confidential conversation. It shouldn't be recorded or transcribed. So Yeah, every company should have a policy on what that looks like. So just make sure that you define, clearly define that inside your organization.
So could a company, ban a personal recording device, from being used in the workplace? Does that
Sure.
violate any
And
kind
if
of
the company
privacy?
sets a
Okay.
policy and they can ban that, the company's policy would go beyond, what the state allows. So, you just want to make sure that you have it as an acceptable use policy on when and where these devices are allowed, whether it's, augmented reality glasses. Meta has some glasses out there through Ray-Ban and some other ones that are kind of interesting. Those, like I mentioned, the recording wearable that does the transcription. There's a few companies that do those. Your employees might already be wearing or having these. You just need to make sure that you have an acceptable use policy of when and where those are allowed. And I think it's for the safety of others. Obviously you don't want to take augmented reality cameras into the bathroom, for example. I mean, that should be a safe place,
Right.
from recording and pictures and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of concerns on when or where these type of devices should be used in the workplace and in general. I think as a society.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there'll probably be more lawsuits or legal actions because I've seen the glasses and there's a little light that comes on and it's not supposed to work. Not record if somebody covers up the light, but I have seen that people have figured out a way to kind of block it so people can't actually see that the recording light is on. If people can, I guess they will. But in the workplace, we always emphasize policies. Can workplaces issue their own, like they want people to use an AI wearable note taker? Can it be a work issued one? Would all the information be stored in the workplace's system?
That would be ideal. I think any if you're encouraging it or want it, then it should be a company owned system, and the data is stored in a company vault so that the data doesn't leak outside the company. So, if it's a personal note taker that somebody's personally be paying for, then they more likely than not own that information. But if the company has it, then just like company email, company data storage, that's the company data. So if you are allowing this and you want employees to use note takers, things like that, you as a company need to decide what's allowed and then provide that for your employees to use.
Is there a way to have like multi-factor authentication, especially when you're talking about there's the recording devices, but we also talked about other badges and scanners and stuff like that. How do you can you make sure the right person is accessing those?
Yeah, some of them do come with like fingerprint scanners as part of them, so that, if you have sensitive areas or you want to ensure that employees are, the ones using it, there are, fingerprint accessible devices that would be probably the best multi-factor authentication if you can do that. There's other things that, maybe if it's connecting to a local device, if it has, Microsoft Authenticator or something that it's using to access it, that would be ideal. Each one of them would have their own security mechanisms, and it would be a good opportunity to talk to your IT provider before purchasing something to discuss the security portion of it. I think MFA is a good point. Is you want to make sure that it's just not on arbitrarily or it can't be stolen and used by another person, depending on what it is, especially when you're talking like access control, maybe time and attendance, having that two-factor authentication. I think historically, like, badge scanning often to secure areas would have the badge scan plus like a PIN code. So that would be two-factor authentication. You'd have to know the PIN and have the badge. But you could add something even more biometric wise with fingerprint scanning or retina scanning, things like that to enhance security even more.
How can businesses keep themselves from going overboard? Because some things might seem like a good idea without realizing that they are invading privacy, like location tracking. How much can they track where their employees are? And how can businesses, make sure that they're not overstepping?
Yeah, I think I do agree that there's a fine line. A case in point on this, for example, we're investigating some new dispatching software and overall ticketing software inside our company. And we have a lot of employees that are in the field, and I really like some features of one of the systems we were looking at that would use some automation technology to decide how much travel time is required between appointments. So it would, know the address of one appointment, know, the next appointment, and then it would use some intelligence scheduling to plan out the next activities. Say, hey, don't send this technician there because they're going to be driving 75 minutes versus this other employee could drive 20 minutes. So that's, from a scheduling standpoint, that's great. But even on for the dispatching, if there's emergencies, the dispatchers would be able to pull up where the employees are, based off of where they last logged into the software from their cell phones. And, again, that's ideal, but there should be requirements around that. I think businesses should understand that, end of the day when they're off shift, that tracking needs to be turned off, so that they can't see, where they're at night or, wherever it may be. So I think companies have to have policies and make decisions around that to ensure that employees still have privacy too, but the functionality is there. A lot of times employees get concerned about it. I don't think companies generally want to be, big brother looking over the shoulder all the time because that's a cost to the business. We have tracking of vehicles at Stimulus, and I certainly don't have a dashboard up all the time to see where they're at. It's only information if we have to do diagnostic of, maybe lack of productivity or, verify that, if there was some type of car accident or, traffic violation, that person was that actual one there driving. But I certainly don't want to sit there and, oh, why were you stopped at that gas station for 17 minutes? It should only take 12 minutes to fill up gas. I mean, that's a little bit too much, right? And so there's always a balance what you do as an organization to ensure that the workers are being productive, but there's got to be some trust too, and then some boundaries around what's allowed and what's not. So each company should think about that, especially if you're these devices more and more have GPS capabilities and tracking capabilities. Employees don't want to be monitored 24/7, 365, and we shouldn't when they're at home or off the clock, especially if they're a non-exempt from overtime employee. We can't be tracking them after hours. So there's definitely some context there that we have to have as business owners around the use of this tracking.
And have helping businesses create these kind of policies or helping with those kind of devices, has that entered into our scope of IT services?
It definitely is an IT issue. The company has to decide what's right for them, and then we can, once that's defined, we can write that into, if they're on our compliance plans at Stimulus, we can help them write those documents. We have templates for them, build off of. And then from a technology standpoint, we can make sure that that technology works right around their policies. So executive decision translated into policy and procedure, and then translated into realistic implementation. And we help with the second and third part. You as a company, decide what makes sense for your business, and that's sometimes a legal question, sometimes just a strategic question inside. And then, us as a IT provider, that's how we help companies make sure it's implemented properly.
All right, well, that's all really interesting information. And we haven't gotten to the point of implants yet that can track our every move, but I think it definitely gives people something to think about when it comes to personal devices and work devices and where they might want to implement work devices in their company.
So what you're saying is someday we'll be part of the Borg collective, Sherry? Is that
Yeah, we'll all be one mind.
we go? Just get our implants in and then we'll be moving to the cube, I guess.
I guess so. Yes. Well, if you read the book The Circle, that it talks a lot about this kind of stuff. So, all right. Well, thanks, Nathan, and thanks everybody for listening. And let us know, do you use any of these kind of devices?
Like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.